Welcome to the Andrew Holland Podcast, where we talk about business, entrepreneurship, and everything in between. Now, here's your host, Andrew Holland.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Andrew Holland Podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Holland. As a business owner and an entrepreneur who has started and sold multiple companies, as well as being a CPA that's worked in the corporate world, I started this podcast to be the ultimate support group for entrepreneurs and business owners. When I was starting my business many years ago, about 15 years ago, years 2 or 3, I began to feel very lonely, like nobody knew what I was going through. And you may feel that if you have been working on growing your business or you're just thinking about starting a business. But none of us should ever have to feel alone. So, this podcast, the Andrew Holland Podcast, is intended to be your weekly go to source for inspiration, guidance, and valuable insights. And so that you can recognize, even though you may feel like you're alone, you're not. So, join us every week where we'll talk about various business concepts. We'll have interviews. Sometimes I'll have monologues. We'll have book reviews. And we'll explore other relevant formats as we have fun with the podcast. And we will discuss everything in between business, entrepreneurship, and just overall being a successful entrepreneur. So please help me support our podcast by following and liking us on your favorite podcast outlet, whether it's Spotify or Apple Podcasts or YouTube Podcasts. And of course, subscribe to our YouTube channel, the Andrew Holland Podcast, so that you get the weekly updates when we post the video version every Wednesday. And follow me on Twitter and Threads. My handle is A Holland Podcast. That's A Holland Podcast. And there we have conversations throughout the week about topics we covered in that week's podcast and all other relevant business conversations. And of course, be sure to listen and watch every week and share this podcast or the YouTube channel with your friends, family, and colleagues. Keep in mind that we often talk about financial and legal concepts, so don't ever take anything you hear on this podcast or any other podcast for that matter as the absolute gospel truth. Be sure you're always consulting the appropriate professionals in your areas for your unique situations to get the best advice. Thank you so much for joining us each and every Wednesday to talk about business, entrepreneurship, and everything in between. For this week's episode, we're continuing on the book review that we started in episode 34, talking about Jim Collins' book, From Good to Great. And there are so many incredible concepts in this book that I wanted to split this into two different podcasts. If you remember, if you've listened to episode 34, we talked about multiple concepts like the hedgehog concept, the flywheel effect, and a few other important key ideas that Jim talks about that he identified through all of his years of research of what makes companies go from being good companies to great companies. And so we're going to continue with that book review and conclude on a number of concepts that I think really hit it home and that we as entrepreneurs can apply and think about, or should apply and think about almost on a daily basis if we really want to have the best company that we can have. So let's jump right in and continue with some of the concepts. As I said, these book reviews are not by any means intended to be a substitution for actually reading the book because you get so much additional information and detail, but it gives you an idea of some of the most important concepts that are covered. And I think you'll find when you go through these book reviews, this book in particular is well worth the read. So, continue on the concepts that Jim goes through. And there are a lot throughout the book, so we can't cover all of them in the book review. So I'm highlighting the key ones. Of course, read the book to get the context and everything for the concepts we discuss and many other concepts that we don't get the opportunity to talk about in this podcast. So one of the things that I think is particularly relevant today that Jim talks about when he identified companies who are not just good companies, but have transitioned to great companies. We've talked about Nucor. We've talked about Abbott Laboratories in the previous podcast on the review. We've talked about Walgreens, Kimberly-Clark. And this idea of technology, he talks about the importance of technology accelerators. And, you got to remember this was written probably 10, 15 years ago. And he, even then, that's when the internet was really coming to be. He talked about that as we continue to navigate the digital age, he identified that with these great companies, technology played a crucial role in the company's success. But he made a very important distinguishing feature between those companies that didn't just accept or adopt technology for the sake of doing it. The companies that utilized technology recognized that it should be an accelerator of momentum, not a creator of it. And the reason I say this is so important or particularly relevant in this day and age, because as we've talked about on many episodes or previous episodes in this podcast, AI or artificial intelligence is all the talk in the technology sector this year, 2023. And so I've read so many different articles across so many platforms about, is your company adopting AI? If you're not doing the right things. Adopting AI for the sake of adopting AI is pointless. And it goes directly or speaks directly to this point that Jim made in his book many years ago when he looked and researched at the best companies. And they recognized that, yes, technology is key to moving from a good to a great company. It is key to running an efficient organization and to generating the types of returns that the stakeholders want and to having a well established, strong organizational culture. But technology was simply utilized to further enhance those things. Technology was not adopted just for the sake of adopting it. They took the technology and they aligned it with their core strategies, thereby utilizing it so that they could emphasize their existing strengths. Now, the book talks about Kroger and how they had a real big focus on improving inventory management and enhancing the customer experience. And if you think about when this book was written and you think about the technology at the time, we were just getting comfortable with World Wide Web. We were just starting to get a better understanding of how meaningful the internet could change not only our personal lives, but all business operations. And we've heard of lean inventory management, just in time. And so Kroger didn't just adopt this technology because everybody else was adopting it. They said, okay, we know that inventory management is key in our business. It always has been. Kroger, of course, being a retailer, a large retailer in the supermarket industry. And they also wanted to maintain that customer experience. They wanted to have people that came into their stores have a unique and enjoyable customer experience compared to their competitors. And so they figured out a way how to use the technology at the time, and they've continued to do so to this day, to focus on those two key strengths that they have of solid inventory management and customer experience. They just didn't throw some technology in there and say, okay, now what do we do with this? The reason this is such an important one today, as I talked about AI, it's all the hype, but AI may or may not be important for you to adopt in your business right now. For all practical purposes, it just really came out, at least through ChatGPT, and became a hot topic in November of 2022. There's still a lot of areas for improvement. There's still a lot of understanding of how industries and companies can best utilize AI in their particular operations. But you see there seems to be a push or a jump or a feeling, and I have felt this in whether it's in the construction business or whether it's even for this podcast or whether it's for the coffee and bike shop or whether it's for the medical supply company. You read these articles and you feel like, oh, I'm not adopting AI, so I'm behind. Wrong. Don't let technology be adopted for the sake of adopting technology. Understand what your core competencies are, what your strengths are, and then say, okay, given the technology that's available, and obviously technology rapidly changes, is there a way at this point in time, given the technological innovation of AI, that I can implement this into my business to help focus or enhance my core competencies, not to change your strategic vision, not to completely upend what you're doing. If you know what your hedgehog concept is and you know what you're good at and you're building momentum with the flywheel effect, is there a way that technology can help you accelerate that momentum? Talking specifically about AI. If the answer after doing research is it's not quite there yet, be satisfied with that. Always keep in mind that as technology progresses, there may be opportunities to utilize it or into your business operations, but don't feel the need to adopt technology just for the sake of adopting technology. And I think that happens frequently, especially in this day and age of the media when new innovations in technology are exciting and everybody's talking about them. Uh, it's you get this feeling as an entrepreneur that I'm behind. Don't let that happen to you. And if you get that, listen to this podcast. We'll talk about this. Yeah, everybody's talking about AI. And perhaps you're in an industry, as I talked about on a previous episode, where you need to be thinking about what is this going to do to your industry? And should you be adopting it? But as we've stated multiple times, just because it's there doesn't mean it's right for you to use. So always keep that in mind. And I love that this particular concept, so many years ago, that Jim wrote about, that many companies have been thinking about, again, great companies for so long, is this idea that technology is an accelerator of momentum, not a creator. And those companies that are great have technologically driven initiatives that are aligned with their core business strategies, and it helps drive efficiency, customer loyalty, etc. We talk about team a lot on this podcast, and I think for those of us who have been entrepreneurs and have employed many people before, you realize, I through many mistakes and over time and maturing in experience, that you can have the best product in the world, you can have the best idea in the world, but without a solid team or group of people to help you carry it out, and nobody can do it by themselves, or very few people can. Team, your employees, your colleagues, perhaps business partners are incredibly important to running a successful organization. And this next topic that we talk about, as Jim points out, from going from good to a great company. And so he labels this concept in the book as the role of first who, then what. I'm going to say that again. So that's first who, then what. And in the book, Jim underscores the importance of getting the right people on board before setting a specific direction. So this concept suggests that great companies prioritize building a talented and passionate team. And once they're confident that they have that team in place, the team, collaboratively determine what the best path forward for them is. And this is often talked about in the book and in reality, in application, when a company is struggling and you know that a change needs to be made. And he gives multiple examples in the book of how this concept was utilized with struggling companies. And I'll let you read the book to see the many examples that he talks about. But this first who, then what concept, when you need to make a change, important if you're just starting a business as well, if you have the luxury of having the dream team that you would like, figure out who is the right one to be on the bus, who are the right participants to be driving the bus and the organizational concept, and then focus on what your strategy is going to be. Put simply, people come before strategy. And that concept emphasizes the significance of having the right individuals before deciding on the bus, before deciding where the bus is headed. He gives an example. He gives many examples. I'll give one of them that he talks about. Philip Morris, the tobacco company, people first approach, and they underwent a real transformation during their period of kind of transforming from good to great by focusing on getting the right people in key leadership spots And they did that before they decided on what direction that they should take the company. And of course, Big Tobacco went through a lot of pushback in the second half of the 20th century when people, or we as a nation, began to realize the negative impact, health impacts of cigarettes and what they were selling. So they had a lot of turnover, and they had to really think about what is the most strategic direction for them to take in light of all the negative health media, or I should say, negative health impacts that were brought out in the media and became more well known throughout, not only in the United States, but generally speaking, worldwide. And so their approach of putting the right people on the bus first and getting the right team helped them navigate through these challenging times and find a strategic direction for the company that would work. So, if you're in a company right now and you're looking at trying to achieve multiple objectives, perhaps you're trying to achieve 20% growth year over year, whatever the goals you have, and you'll have short term goals and long term goals, take a step back and ask, am I being realistic with what I'm trying to accomplish, what the strategic vision of my company is, where I'm trying to take the company, or where you as a management team, if you're in a large organization, perhaps a publicly traded company, do I have the right people on the bus to take me from point A to point B to point C? And I've experienced this before, and I'm sure some of you listening have also experienced this. This can be a real awakening when you identify that where you want to take the company is not possible with the current team in place. Now, there can be multiple reasons for this. Perhaps you have a team, you have the right people on the team, but you don't have a big enough team, or you're missing a set of skill sets that you need to get from point A to point B to point C. That is maybe a little less daunting than having to get rid of people on your team, but nonetheless challenging, because if you need to grow your team, that can be expensive. And maybe you don't have the luxury of growing your team. And I think that brings up a good point that we'll talk about in just a bit. Jim highlights throughout this book, and primarily towards the end, that all of these companies that he talks about and the concepts didn't implement any of these concepts overnight. These transitions for these companies from good to great took many years, decades oftentimes. And it was a meaningful, thoughtful focus on each of these individual concepts and making the changes required within their organizations to eventually go from good to great. And so I think it's important to remember that when we talk about these concepts, and when I talk about whether it's my business or ask you to focus on your business, these things don't happen overnight, but they never happen if you don't stop and take a step back to think about these concepts. So don't feel the pressure of this one, for example. First two, then what? If you identify that you have someone wrong on the team, that doesn't mean you need to fire them tomorrow, or perhaps you need to grow your team because you're missing a certain skill set. These things take time. And so always put the things we talk about in the concept or the perspective of, okay, I've identified that I don't have the right team to get from point A to point B. What changes do I need to make to get the right team? And then set a time frame for yourself. Don't just leave it open, because any good goal always has a meaningful, it has measurable statistics, it has timelines attached to it. Those are two key important pieces of actually trying to accomplish what you're trying to accomplish. So back to focusing on you asking questions about your business. And I try to do this frequently. I want to get from point A to point B. Is my team big enough? Do I have the right people on the team? What skill sets am I missing? And sometimes you need to, I won't say change your strategic objective, but you need to let the first who, then what concept dictate where you can take the company, how far you can take the company, until you have the right team in place. Think about that in your business and in your industry. Now, perhaps you're in a golden state of having the right team, and now they just need a leader or they need help executing it. That's a fantastic position to be in. The other thing about this is sometimes you have the right team to get from point A to point B, but then once you get to point B, you either need to transition your team, you need to add people to your team, you need to make adjustments in your team. So this is a constant dynamic scenario where first to then having the right team, you may need to make changes over time. And that's one of the interesting things I find in the book is that Jim points out that a lot of times a certain leadership group could take the company from, a point A to point B, so halfway in between from good to great, but really to take that next step, they had to completely, the board of the company, for example, had to completely revolutionize or change out the executive team to make that final leap from midway between good to great all the way to great, and then continue organizational culture of success. So another point to bring up here, all of these things we talk about, you don't just implement one of these concepts and, okay, check that off the box. It's not like that. This is a constant feedback loop of always analyzing and assessing for each of these concepts. Okay, how are we doing on the first who, then what? How are we doing on the hedgehog concept? Has our hedgehog concept or our real key, what we're awesome at, our strength changed over time? Does it need to change, etc.? So just be mindful that this is a dynamic process. Each of these concepts may work for some time, and then you need to reassess them, and then you need to change. Moving on to one of the final concepts that I want to talk about that Jim talks about, and this is so relevant in every facet of life, and he calls it confronting the brutal facts. And we've talked about this on the podcast when we've talked about self-assessing ourselves, when we've talked about doing self-assessment or doing assessments of your team. Sometimes, oftentimes, this is one of the hardest concepts for not only each of us individually or personally to deal with or accept, but companies as an organization, it can be even more challenging because you have multiple different ideas and you have many people on the executive team, depending on the size of your company, that have to all be willing to, as Jim calls it, confront the brutal facts. And that's really facing reality head on is a hallmark of great companies. And Collins introduces this concept, emphasizing the importance of acknowledging challenges and weaknesses, not just hiding them, not just trying to forget about them. As we all know, conflict only gets worse if you try to avoid it. Problems only get worse if you try to avoid them. Confront them head on, talk about what the problem is. Again, whether it's a challenge, a problem, a weakness, identify how it can be rectified. Don't try to throw it in a closet and close it and hope that it gets better. And by doing that, by confronting the harsh realities, companies can develop effective strategies for improvement and growth. And I think this willingness, as Jim talks about, to address challenges candidly fosters what we've often talked about is so important in companies, culture of continuous improvement. So they make changes and they encourage everybody within the organization to say, okay, we've been doing this for a while. This is how we always do it. But if we look at ourselves in the mirror, we look at the organization for what it is, and we confront the brutal facts, is this how we should be doing it? If not, how do we improve on this? And culture, culture, culture. Throughout the entire book, Jim talks about the only companies that get from good to great always take these concepts that we've been talking about and all the concepts he talks about in the book in the context of fostering an incredible company culture, one that allows for continuous improvement, one that allows for confronting the brutal facts, one that allows for speaking up no matter what position you are in the company to say, you know what, this may have been our strength under the hedgehog concept a while ago, but it isn't anymore. And we need to confront the brutal reality that we need to either change or we're going to die. And one of the companies that Jim talks about uh, is Circuit City and how their unwillingness or their inability to find an executive team who understood how to implement these concepts or had the willingness to implement these concepts, who had the willingness to implement this particular concept of confronting the brutal facts that things were changing, how consumers bought electronics, really ultimately ended in their demise. And you juxtapose that to Best Buy and how they've continually kept up And they've gone through their challenges as well, but they have done an excellent job of applying these concepts, confronting the brutal facts, and making changes necessary as technology changes, because those two companies were so technology driven or operate in an industry where technology is key. So I love those two compared to each other, Circuit City versus Best Buy. And I think those particular companies put an excellent or make an excellent example of a company that moved from good to great by focusing on the honest, brutal facts, and a company that didn't. Jim also gives an excellent example of Kimberly Clark, which we talked about in the previous episode under another concept. And he talks about how during Darwin Smith's leadership, the company, Kimberly Clark, had to really confront the harsh reality of the business segments that they were in that were declining tremendously. And then they had to make the tough decisions to just get rid of them, to divest them, to sell them off. And we've seen that with lots of companies, whether it's General Electric, there are other companies that we could name off, that they're in so many different things. And you get a new leader who takes a look and says, why are we in all of these segments just for the sake of being in these segments? This division isn't profitable. This particular segment isn't profitable. And it's hard. It's hard to make decisions about moving out of segments and into segments. I have firsthand experience with this in the garbage company that Joe and I had, Proviro. In probably year 2 or 3, we realized that we couldn't operate both in the roll off segment, those big containers that you often see on construction sites or you might get from your home to do a full house clean out, and be in the weekly garbage service for residential and commercial customers, primarily because we didn't have the resources to build the team that was required, number one. And number two, because neither Joe nor I came from money and we were growing this business all from nothing, from scratch. And as I've said in one of the first episodes, primarily on debt, credit card debt, we had to make the decision to sell our roll off segment to another competitor so that we could leverage down, pay down debt, and we could bring some cash, a cash infusion into the company so that we could grow what we looked to be a more recurring revenue segment, the weekly trash pickup, weekly trash and recycling for commercial and residential clients. And it was a hard decision because that's what the company started on and that's what it was founded on. But we had to confront the brutal reality that either we were going to make a decision to go one way or the other, or we were going to fail altogether. And so we divested. In this case, the roll off segment wasn't unprofitable. It wasn't particularly profitable, primarily just because of the seasonality, but we had to divest for capital reasons. And so, this concept of confronting brutal facts, you make decisions in business, as you're well aware, as many of you as listeners are well aware, all the time, that aren't just based on profitability. Of course, that's ultimately why you're running a business, is you want to be profitable, and of course, you want to employ people, and you want to ensure that what you're doing is sustainable, and that only happens through profitability. But you make decisions to divest for many reasons. In our scenario, it was because we were in such a capital intensive industry, we needed a cash infusion to bring leverage down, not necessarily because it wasn't unprofitable. For Kimberly Clark's scenario, Darwin Smith had to make the decision. They were in declining industries. They simply just did not fit with where the trend in the consumer goods industries were going. That was, of course, manifested as a result in their unprofitability. And perhaps they had profitable segments, but they recognized that the profitability was waning and they needed to get out. And so the point that Jim brings up Kimberly Clark, and as I talk about in my personal experience, this candid assessment allowed Darwin Smith to really turn the company around, get rid of the segments that were uh, bleeding and hurting the bottom line and impacting their culture negatively, and focus on the segments that would allow them to be sustainable in the long run. And I would ask the same concept when you think about your company, or if you're starting a company. A lot of the things we talk about are so beneficial for people already existing in business. But if you haven't started a business, don't let these concepts scare you or deter you. I know it's a lot of information and you don't get there overnight. But the more information you have at the beginning, the more You can change that risk reward ratio if you're thinking about leaving a great corporate job to start a business, or you don't currently have a job and you're young and you're thinking about starting a business. The better you can understand these concepts and be aware of them, whether you can implement them right or not, right away or not. And we certainly, when we were starting, as I said, from nothing, couldn't implement all these companies. And even these incredibly large public companies that Jim talks about in the book, whether Philip Morris, Kimberly Clark, Nucor, Abbott Laboratories, the list goes on, couldn't implement these overnight. And they had tons of capital at their disposal, whether through the debt markets or through the equity markets if they were publicly traded companies. So, when we talk about these concepts, if you haven't started a business, don't let that scare you. But if you're aware of them and you constantly do a review as you start your company, as you think about starting your company, you'll have a much better foundation upon which to build if you can implement these concepts into your company from the very beginning. And when it comes time to scale your team and get a larger team, or when it comes time for you to divest from one segment and move into another segment because things have changed or a particular segment has served its purpose, as it did for ours in the roll off segment, getting it started, you're going to be all the better for it. There's a lot of other concepts that Jim talks about in this book. And I think the one that I want to end with is what Colin talks about. And he concludes, after talking about all of these companies and all these concepts, about the sustainability of greatness. And so it wasn't just the fact that these companies that Jim highlighted went from good to great, but it was the fact that they had the ability to sustain this greatness. And he talks about maintaining excellence over time requires, as we previously said, a vigilance and a commitment to ongoing improvement. And this, of course, is a key concept, not only in our personal lives, but in businesses, for culture. Greatness isn't a one time achievement that you check off the list. And again, we're talking about greatness in the concept of business operational success, generally defined in our current culture as profitability, but not by any means the exclusionary fact of greatness. As a matter of fact, I would call it a secondary uh, point of being a great company. I would argue that the greatest companies are the companies that have a sustainable business model, meaning they go with industry trends, and that includes profitability, but that they focus on culture. They have a culture that people want to be a part of. They have strong level 5 leadership, people that listen, that make adjustments, that recognize that they don't know everything themselves, people that confront the honest, brutal facts. Greatness is not just about profitability. Yes, you need profitability to have a sustainable, great company. And so don't ever lose focus of having profitability. But that profitability is merely an effect of being great in all these other areas, understanding what you're best at, focusing on the first two and then what, embodying a cultural within your organization of continual improvement, feedback, listening to everybody in the company. Everybody is important to ultimately accomplishing the overall company's mission. This whole concept of greatness is a continuous journey of growth, adaptation, and innovation. Jim brings up the example of Gillette and the long term approach that they take. Interestingly enough, I've seen their newest marketing campaign, Gillette, and perhaps you have as well. They've created a whole new line of Gillette products, which to me doesn't seem that different than all of their other lines of product. But one of the things they're fantastic at is marketing. And I'm sure this marketing campaign that they're doing with their new, I don't remember what it's called, Gillette Shock 4 or whatever it uh, is one of their key strategic reasons for success is they come up with a new product or they make a slight tweak to their product about how men can better shave their faces or get better hairstyling tips or grooming tips, and then they market the heck out of it. And they've been very, very successful at doing it for a long time. They've focused on product innovation. They have loyal customers and they really focus on quality manufacturing. And I think that's why they've been able to sustain, as Jim puts out, this greatness over a long period of time. In spite of the relatively simple industry that they're in of grooming. And they primarily focus on the men's industry. I'm sure they have female. Well, I know they have female products, but their newest marketing campaign focuses on a product innovation. So they say within the men's grooming area. So this book is, as I said in the previous episode, one of my most favorite business books I've read because it encapsulates so many important business concepts that I either learned the hard way and then I read this book, or I had an understanding of but didn't have the opportunity to implement until later in the business. And one of the final things that he concludes with is we're talking about, and we have in this episode and the previous episode, all of these concepts as it relates to businesses, organizations. But Jim does a really good job towards the end of the book of saying, all of these things that we've talked about, while they apply to organizations, he talks about how he's utilized them as he did his research on a personal level, and how he took these concepts to write a better book to improve his personal life. Whether he was focusing on his relationship or he was focusing on his kids. And so that's what I love about this book is while it's primarily focused on concepts that organizations need to be aware of to go from good to great, these organizations or these concepts can be applied just as much personally as they can at an organizational level. I want to hear your feedback on this. If you haven't read the book, please, I encourage you to do so. I think you're going to find it a thrilling read. I read it frequently. I've read it multiple times. I try to read it probably once every 2 or 3 years. And I always get something new from the book. And it's always a good reminder for all the organizations and businesses that I'm in to take a step back and say, am I properly applying these concepts? And as we talked about, this is a continuous feedback loop. You're constantly thinking about, what am I doing to get my company to go from good to great? Go to our website, theandrewhollandpodcast.com. Follow me on Twitter, @HollandPodcast, and Threads. Tell me your thoughts on the book. If you read it, if you haven't, like I said, read it. Are there concepts? There are a lot of concepts in the book that we haven't talked about. I picked out the ones that I found most important or ones that I like the most. There's still a lot of them that I wish we could cover, but we would be here for many episodes of the podcast. But I want to hear your thoughts. This podcast is only as good and is only as great as we collectively make it. So reach out to me. Like I said at the beginning, subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Andrew Holland Podcast, so that you get the updates every week when we post the video version of the podcast. Like our channel, share our podcast with your friends and colleagues so we can continue to be a support group for each other as we all work to grow our businesses and, of course, talk about business, entrepreneurship, and everything in between. Thank you so much again for joining us this week. That's all the time we have. Have a great rest of your week, and we'll talk again next Wednesday. Thank you for listening to the Andrew Holland Podcast. Be sure to visit our website, theandrewhollandpodcast.com, for additional content on business, entrepreneurship, and everything in between. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Andrew Holland Podcast, to get notifications when new podcasts have been released. And lastly, follow us on Twitter, @Holland Podcast. That's @Holland Podcast for all the conversations we're having outside the podcast. Thanks again so much for joining us this week. Have a great day, and we'll talk again next week.